Hi everyone, John Doring here, and this is the X. Welcome back to NMRAx, the place where model railroaders and railroad modelers and all of us who are crazy about trains come together to share ideas and insights and inspirations. Come on in, but remember to tell your friends you heard it here on the X. So I'm really excited. We have a team of presenters up next, two clinicians, the first of which models the Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo Railway at HO scale. He lives about 90 kilometers west of Toronto in Ontario. The other clinician models a fictitious lumber railroad deep in the mountains of British Columbia in O scale. He and his wife Mary live 53 miles from the US border near Windsor, Ontario. He's a life member of the NMRA, and both are executive members of the NMRA's Western Ontario division. So if you are interested in coniferous trees, all morning, guys, I kept saying carnivorous trees. It's not carnivorous trees, but coniferous trees, conifers. Here's how you make them. Please help me to welcome Paul Hurley and Pat Rivard.
Thanks very much for the introduction, and welcome everyone to our clinic on making coniferous trees. And yes, it's coniferous, not carnivorous. However, I suppose if they fall on you in the forest, you may not hear it coming, but some people might say, I was hit by a coniferous tree. I'm Paul Hurley. I'll be turning things over to my colleague and friend Pat Rivard in a few minutes, and we're going to go back and forth as we work our way through our presentation. Very clearly, this clinic is for those people who are obviously interested in putting trees on their layout, but also people who are interested in scenicking in general and very much like to do the modeling or building part of the hobby. So this session is very much for adding to your repertoire of techniques and ideas and skills. Just before I leave this title slide, I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of things here. This is a very typical Northwest United States or West Coast Canadian forest scene. Lots of rainfall in this part of the continent, at least most of the year. And so you get this very, very deep undergrowth, although as is apparent from this picture, there's not necessarily a lot of sunlight that reaches the floor. The other thing, though, I really wanted to draw your attention to, and hopefully you can all see where my cursor is just above the eye in making. Note the lower branches and the number of lower branches on this and all the trees to the right of it. They're broken off, they're dead, but there's these stubs up and down the trunk. So this is very much a part of the theme of what Pat and I will talk about at the beginning of this presentation, and that is take your cues from nature. So we're, of course, into the species that is coniferous, keeps its needles most of the time, all year round. There are a few species in Canada that do drop them, but we're generally looking at the type that hold their needles all year round. And very much Pat and I take our inspiration not only in modeling trees, but other aspects of scenery by looking at nature. Key, though, is that you want to look at nature in the area where you're going to be modeling. As is perhaps apparent to many of you that heard the introduction, Pat and I live in southwestern Ontario, or west of the city of Toronto. And yet, ironically, many of the modelers within our branch or our division of the National Model Railroad Association tend to model scenes and railroads that are elsewhere. Very popular among the modelers in this part of Ontario is the northeastern United States. So in some instances, choosing coniferous and other scenes that are just outside your window aren't appropriate. So road trips, railfan trips into that area are important, but also taking lots of photos of the scenery that you want to model at some point is a very important part of keeping it looking real. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take a look at British Columbia, where Pat certainly locates his layout. Mine, as it was indicated in the introduction, is in southern Ontario, Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo Railroad. But look at these shots of trees off the side of a mountain in this case. Notice the rugged terrain behind this setting. So these coniferous trees, like many throughout our part of the world, tend to grow in really poor soil, often have wet feet, bedrock just below the soil, and yet will sometimes defy gravity, as in this particular shot down a mountain gorge. Notice the trees having a small, somehow, foothold on the side of the cliff. Note when you look across the ridge line on the far side, though, it isn't necessarily all green right to the bottom. Again, we can see trees with lots of dead branches. In fact, some trees that are gray to the top, indicating that they've died out at some point. Another, seems like a really nice environment, lots of moisture, but there's a lot of turbulence, a lot of air that goes down any gorge. And so trees in this kind of environment are heavily buffeted. And we have some, and I'm sure, in fact, I know I've seen others in other coastal areas around the world where the tree trunks are bent and gnarly because of the constant exposure to strong prevailing winds. So again, we don't have to model everything perfectly straight, and we can take lots of cues from the setting that we're putting our model railroad in. This shot we left in because it's not so much the branches, it's just showing us the tree trunk. I don't know about the rest of you, but I know that when I was modeling or drawing trees back in primary school, I tended, for whatever reason, to make all the trunks brown. But in fact, in the real world, that's rarely the case. Quite often they look like this particular specimen, kind of a silvery gray with lots of striations. And Pat and I will be showing you how we add that texture into the bark surface. Notice also the leftover stubs of branches that have actually now completely fallen off, and a little bit of weeping from some of the ones at the top end where sap begins to come out, and dirt and other debris matter in the air will stick to that, and add lots of texture and lots of color variation to a trunk. So really good to remember something like that and perhaps place it near the foreground in a particular scene that you're modeling. So let's take a look at how certainly Pat has executed British Columbia trees on his layout, and then we'll get into the techniques that we've been using to model coniferous trees on both of our layouts. So this is the Valley City Railroad. As said at the outset, it is a fictitious railroad, but set in lumber country in British Columbia. So lots of different types of trees across the ridge line. Some aspen deciduous, the yellow tree interspersed as well, and lots of ground cover showing. Here again, a wide range of different varieties, and of course vegetation attracts wild animals, as seen in the lower right. Well, we've hopefully got modelers from all over North America as well as around the world, and depending on what you're modeling, there's lots of variety. Coniferous trees are on every continent on this planet, and if you don't have good photographs or you need close-up detail, the internet is rich with these silhouettes that you can Google up in images. So here's a sampling from across temperate North America as well as Europe. And the same here. And more from Europe. And notice as well that the variety of different branch arrangements and angles. We want to be conscious of that as we select armature material, how much flocking we add, but also how we attach our branches to the trunk itself. And Australia, look at the great variety here. The Sumatra is a lovely, to my way of thinking about it, gnarly type of tree, very reminiscent of spruce that we'll see along the Lake Superior North shoreline. And the Norfolk Island one, very unique needle structure, but certainly the tree on the right, or on the left, excuse me, I don't have the name for that one, but it's very reminiscent of a lot of the kinds of coniferous trees we'd see in certain parts of North America as well. So regardless of where you live, coniferous trees, if you are in a appropriate setting away from a city, they deserve a spot in the wild on your layout. So Pat will start to walk us through the tools and techniques that we use. Pat, over to you.
Thanks, Pat. We're getting feedback. Are you getting feedback?
Pat, maybe dial down your speaker. Pat, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Go ahead, please.
How's that? Go better?
We were not getting feedback. I wasn't on my computer.
Okay. Well, we're going to try and show you how to make some of these famous trees. And these are some of the tools and paints that I use. There's a picture of what I use on the layout to make these trees. Sandpaper, plastic container for your paint. I use a latex paint, usually a mixture of black and brown. The brown's just to tone down the black. There's a reciprocal saw blade. I used one, of course. Then there's your carving knife, a yellow thing. And what I like about that is you can break off the ends of the blades and still have a sharp blade all the time. Then there's a sponge sand blocking there. And then there's a little brush to clean up your blooming mess that you leave behind, that's for sure. Then there's two brushes, one very stiff brush and another softer brush. And then you'll see a little tool there at the bottom. It's called my graining tool. I picked that up at Michael's here in Ontario. It was used in flower arrangements. They put it at the base of a jar and then they shove their flower stems into those. I saw this on the get rid of aisle, so I picked it up and I thought, well, you know, I could try that out. So what the heck? What do you got to lose? Anyway, and moving on to the right, you'll see some of the balsa wood I use. One, the square block is balsa, and I'll tell you the reasons why I use balsa as we move on. Next, you'll see that I take the balsa, the square balsa, and I take a raw piece, then I shape it. And then another stage of what I do is I add the grain detail, and then I sand it, and I paint it, and then I place the branches on. So we'll move on and show you how to do that. Here you'll see one of the pieces that I use. It's usually about, in my scale, a 1/2 inch square or bigger. Depending on what type of tree you're building, you want a big trunk. That's what you use, 1/2 inch or bigger in O scale. And moving down into HO, I try with the 3/8 inch and smaller as you go down to N scale. You'll see on the right a partially carved piece of balsa that I use to make the trunk. Moving on, you'll see how I do that. Here I take the carving knife and I try to take the corners off of the balsa. And what I'll do is I'll try and lay it down and push the knife along and just take off pieces of it and taper it just a bit. You don't have to take it all off. Just take off some of it. Leave some behind. And at the base, I try to leave square or bigger because your base is usually the biggest part of your trunk. Moving on, Paul. Here you see that famous graining tool. I got it laying on my workbench there, and I kind of slide the piece along on that one there, but I like to do it by hand. I'll hold that tool and I'll hold that balsa wood and I'll just scrape it along where I carved it, and that kind of shapes the tree in a more rounder shape. Razor saws can be used in this case as well. Another thing I found is sometimes you'll break the trunk. Balsa is soft, but I don't let that worry me. I just stick a toothpick in the end of it, drill a little hole, stick the toothpick in, take the two pieces, put them back together, let it dry, and grain it again, and you'll never know it was there. And a crooked trunk is more realistic than something that's straight. I got a tree growing in my front yard and it's got a crooked trunk, so I don't know what isn't right. Go ahead.
Just to jump in, Pat, if I may, for a moment.
Yeah.
To those listening in, I model in HO, so I start, of course, with a smaller stock material when I'm modeling trees, in particular coniferous. And because they're smaller, I've found that I was running into more problems with breakage. So whether I'm using a tool like this or more often I use a fairly coarse razor saw, I like to lay my stock down flat on the surface, and then rather than draw it through the material, I use the tool and draw it along the length of the fully supported balsa. And that way I found that my breakage reduced significantly.
Yeah, you're right, Paul. Here, go ahead. We sand off a bit of it so that you don't have to take it all off. You're going to have a rough trunk. A trunk of a tree is never really smooth. Some of the fuzz is always on there, and you just want to leave some of it behind. And you'll see why later as we paint it. The final result is after it's been sanded is right there. You can see it. You're leaving some of the grain behind, but you don't want to take it all away by sanding it away. It's ready for staining at this point. Now, I usually mix up a mixture of black latex paint and some of that burnt umber, or a mixture of brown. And you can use the cheap paint that you buy from Hobby Lobby, or not Hobby Lobby, but Michael's, or any of those places that have, or even a paint store. If they got a leftover black paint, buy it. And it can be gloss or otherwise, because it will dry flat when you put it on this trunk. Now, the black paint settles in the grooves, but don't let that worry you, because that's where you want the detail to be. And it also will absorb a lot of the paint. And the paint will lighten as it dries.
One good, if I can just jump in, Pat, one good source of small amounts of paint that I've found is, over the last couple of years, some of the do-it-yourself stores, the big box stores that we have certainly in North America. I can't speak for Australia, New Zealand, and Europe. They now will sell you just all the primary colors, certainly, in very small little test bottles. They're about 1 pint or smaller, so they're a lot cheaper than even buying a quart size of paint, or taking your luck and periodically looking at where people have mixed the wrong formulas, because you'll sometimes just not get a tint that you want. So this way you can get a true black paint, but not get stuck with large amounts of it if you're going to be diluting it for this kind of activity. Back to you, Pat.
Yeah, and don't dilute it as much as you can, because what you'll find is that it'll absorb faster. The water helps it to absorb faster. And don't be afraid to use a foam brush, just a cheap foam brush, usually about 20 cents or 25 cents a piece here. But it's just a cheap brush, and it'll help soak it in.
Pat, do you find a couple of drops of dish detergent help with the absorption?
You don't need it. To be honest with you, Paul, I think you don't really need it, because I found it just sucks right into the darn thing. It doesn't help it any better, I don't think. But you can put it in if you want to do it. It doesn't matter. You can't hurt it. Here you'll see I'm using a hair dryer. That's not necessary if you're doing a whole lot of them. You can paint one and move on to about 10 or 15 others. By the time you get done painting them with that black and brown mix, you'll find that the first one is already dried. And if you look closely as the hair dryer is on there, you'll notice that some of it is already starting to turn a whitish color. And that's where you want. It'll come out just looking like that after it dries enough.
Yeah, it's that variation in the texture, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And you'll see that down below there, that little rag I use sometimes to wipe it off if it's too much. It don't matter. It'll dry up. Dry brushing. I think a lot of us in model railroading know what dry brushing is all about. And you want to dry brush the trunk after it has dried enough. So what you want to do is take the stiff end brush and dip it in a little bit of white paint, cheap latex paint, or those artist paints or whatever. And what you want to do is kind of take off the most of it and then go across the grain of the trunk. You don't want to go with it. Otherwise, you'll ruin the finish of the darkness in the grain of the trunk. You don't want to cover that up. So brush across the grain and not with it. The result of dry brushing, you can see what it looks like there. And as it dries, it gives a nice texture. And the dark shows through. Now, some trees, as you know, have a little bit of moss growing on them because there's a lot of wet areas that they grow in. So what I do is I usually take a small jar of this Doc O'Brien brand weathering powder, which is called mildew green, and I'll put it on with a soft brush onto the trunk in certain areas while it's still drying. Now, another way you can do that is just touch it up a little bit with some more white dry brushing and just hit that with by putting a dip of that into that mildew green and putting it onto the trunk of the tree. And it'll leave just a little bit behind. So it looks kind of realistic. No tree is perfectly smooth, so don't panic if it looks like it's, crooked and cut in. It gives it to the realism of the whole tree itself. And it will raise the fibers as you paint it. So if you want, you can touch it a little bit with sanding, but I wouldn't do too much to it. Note the hint of the moss on the tree there where it's dried. Remember, when you plant a tree, the moss is usually at the north side of the tree. Now we're going to stand there with a compass and find out which is the north side of our layout. You just want to put it on in the front of your layout and show that moss that's on the tree, because people walking by will notice it.
And of course, for those who may be listening from the southern hemisphere, it's the opposite. The moss, I'm sure, is always growing on the other side of your tree, pointing towards the Antarctica. But if you're in Europe or Canada or the United States, yeah, it's going to be on the north side of your tree.
Mhm.
Let's go on then from the trunk, and we'll start looking at putting on the branch structure. One of the first things we do, though, is both for holding it and for planting it, add a little piece of dowel, or in my case, because I'm working on a smaller scale, I'll use a good round toothpick,
I
drill
tell
a
you
hole
what,
in the bottom, and
I
then
could
put a little
slip
bit
in,
of white glue.
if I could slip in, Paul, I think
Yeah,
when I first started building these, I used a piece of steel, or not steel, but a piece of copper wire that come out of house wiring. And I drilled a hole and I put it in. But I found after a while it was a pain in the neck and it was very hard to work with. So what I use is skewer sticks also. So anyway, go ahead, Paul.
yeah, thanks, Pat. And yes, I sometimes will use metal as well. My armature of choice, or a peg of choice, if I'm going that way, is usually a long straight pin. I just clip off the one end and then stick it into the bottom with a little bit of crazy glue. But I also use wood, as I said at the outset. So now we've got something that we can both hold with, so we can work right down to the bottom if we need to, but also this gives us the basis for planting the tree when we're completed with our work and happy. So from here, there's a number of different products that are available, most of them through florist businesses, wherever you can buy flower arrangements. However, with the advent of some of the craft stores, you can find some prepared dried flowers. A lot of these kinds of materials, like caspia, which is shown here, are used by florists as a way of kind of filling out a bouquet. They're kind of accent filler plants. Um, I sometimes find that if I speak to a florist about a week in advance, there seems to be a particular day of the week that they get the fresh shipment. And so that's when they'll have enough that they can sell a little bit to me on the side. Obviously, they want to not over buy a supply of anything on a particular time, but they've always seemed to be happy to sell not only this, but floral wire and other products that are specific to their trade. But again, craft stores can be another potential source depending on where you live. So we mix up again a basic green material, diluted, as you can see here. And here definitely we've found that adding in, which has caused the foam that you can see on the left, a little bit of detergent helps with the penetration. It breaks down the viscosity of the water, much like when we're working on ballast. And then we will lay this out, or sometimes just hang it up to dry. And you want to make sure you've got lots of newsprint down, or plastic sheeting, because it will at times drip if there's a little too much that's on it. You can see some of that drip down on the right-hand photograph. And you don't necessarily want all the same color. So by varying the green that you use, or the amount of water that you've added into it, you can get different shades coming out of the material.
If I may step in here, Paul.
Absolutely.
The painting of that brush or that bush, I did it that way because it was a lot cheaper and a lot faster than trying to do it with a spray bomb. I find I wasted more spray bomb paint all over
Oh,
the
for
place,
sure.
and this made it a lot easier. and more control.
By spray bomb, you mean, for example, a
Green.
rattle can.
Yeah, the old rattle can green or the rattle can brown.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And of course, you want a good wide mouth jar
Exactly.
because this stuff tends to spread. We're going to break it down later, but you want a large branch to just make it easy to do a lot at a time.
Yep.
So here you see Pat breaking off the now dyed material or painted material into the small pieces that are going to ultimately make up the branch structure on the particular coniferous tree that he's wanting to model. And we keep everything certainly at this stage. So you'll notice that there's a sparse piece at the bottom that might work very, very well for those kinds of nubby bits that we saw in the very outset photograph that was used for our cover for this presentation. So we get a sort of a stock of these, and I like to sort them in different sizes. It just makes it easier once I get going. We then start at the top, and depending on your species, many of the coniferous trees that we have in Ontario and British Columbia certainly will always have a branch coming right out the very top. So a hole in the top, and then we'll start a drill structure down the trunk diameter. And again, the placement will be very much determined by the species, and that's where the silhouettes I find are very helpful. You can see whether the branches come off of the trunk opposite each other, or whether they are slightly above and below each other. Different arrangements, different species. And the more that we can emulate what is in nature, the more we can trick the eye and say, here looks like a very realistic tree on the layout. White glue or carpenter's glue is sufficient for gluing these in. Some people also use well bond. Any good wood glue will hold these in place, and it just needs a little bit of dab. So put something on the lid of a jar or a margarine container, whatever, and then just dip your piece in and then stick it in the hole that you've drilled into your trunk armature. And then we start alternating down the sides, down the diameter of the trunk, rotating it, gluing. And if you drill all the way through, no big problem. You've probably created a good hole on the opposite side for setting what you're going to be doing. Again, the branch structure very much dictated by the species that you want to model. And we do have a couple of tree reference books at the very end of this presentation for those of you who perhaps are just starting out in this and want to do a bit more reading before you get going. So there's an example of a few in place now. This particular one, I think it was a Douglas fir that was being modeled here, but the branches are very much on an alternating pattern. So just spiraling, twisting the trunk in your hand and just drilling a small hole large enough for the floret stub is good enough, and it gives you that variation that you're looking for. So once you're happy, you've got your basic branch structure in place. You'll notice, by the way, on the upper left-hand picture, the angle on these branches is very much downward. So again, another characteristic of this particular species that marks it as different from a number of others that might even grow in the same area of North America. In this case, we're modeling British Columbia forest. So now we want to fill out the actual needle structure on the Caspia. So some shots of hairspray, and certainly Pat's experience has been, and I've followed very much his advice on this, is to get a good quality unscented hairspray and never use spray adhesive. And the problem with that is the spray adhesive tends to clop onto or attach itself onto all of the flocking material that doesn't stick. And so what you end up down in your plastic bin or your catchment area is something that you can't easily reuse. So hairspray, we find, holds what hits and finds a stick, but anything that just passes through can be easily reused and put back in the container for shaking over again. And you can see the buildup. And certainly, if you think back to the raw material just after it had been stained, you can see how the volume of the needle portion of the branch armatures coming off of the trunk is beginning to fill in. And you can do this several times until you get the look that you're happy to. So flock a bit, shake off any excess, gather it up, put it back in the jar, spray again with more hairspray, and apply more until you get the look that you're happy with. And there we are, the finished product.
And that was good.
Pat, please jump back in.
Yeah, I find that another reason why I put them on an angle like that is, but Caspia, when you buy it and it dries, tends to curl upward. So you want to drill them on an angle so it will face downward. As you can see there, the curls in them.
Yeah, good point. And what's interesting too with this close-up is, despite the fact that we've just hit the whole structure with hairspray, you'll notice that not that much has stuck onto the trunk itself. And even some of the branches are still showing bare color through before you actually get up to where the needles are. So this is a pretty realistic simulation of a Douglas fir tree.
Mm-hmm.
Pat, take us through the next steps.
Yeah, go ahead. Move on. Yeah, I always wanted to create a different type of tree, not just the cedars and the. So I thought I'd try and do a Scotch pine tree, and I didn't know what I would use, but I did find that there was another product similar to the armatures that we used before, the Caspia, and it's called German Sepia. The armature is much stronger, much tougher, and a lot more pricklier. But then in this stuff, I would use drill a hole straight on and then put these stems straight out. And the stems are a nice dark brown color. And I found that the same application with the spray, hairspray, and then flocking it so much, not doing ground foam, but flocking it gave it a better effect. And it looked more realistic as a Scotch pine tree. Moving on. The German Sepia, it is very brittle, and I did happen to find a nursery selling out what they had left. I bought a whole box of this stuff, so I got more than I'll ever need for a long time. If somebody wanted to buy some, I got some. Anyway.
But I think your best advice here would be to not necessarily put it where you're going to be reaching through on the layout.
Yeah, you'll find out in a hurry. Go ahead. Now, there's a comparison that I made here. An alternate branch that I have made and used, or not made, but used, was a plastic fern that you can purchase from Hobby Lobby in the States. And it's a US firm. I do have the number, and I do happen to have what it looks like. It comes in a branch like this, a heavy wire branch. And these are the stems right here that I take off. And you take and you pull it off, and there you are, you got one. It has a hole, it's all plastic with flock on it already. When I first started buying these, I found that they were flocked a lot more than they are now. So I added more flock as I go along. Another thing too, you can bend it. Nice for doing on modules that you put out on the floor, and the kids go by and they can hit it, but they can't hurt it. It's one of the best things I like about it. And I sprinkle a lot of it with flock.
It seems to have a little bit of wire up the center, does it not?
No, it's a straight plastic, Paul.
Oh, it is plastic, isn't it?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's just a molded piece of plastic. I don't know how they do it. Comes from China, couldn't tell you. There's a little hole in the end of these, right here, right on the end. And I would put a toothpick in those, and then I would place it right onto the tree. Now, some of these I would cut, as you'll see in that picture. I cut some of them in a different shape. So you can use the end of it, or you can cut it here, and you can shape this on an angle so that with a pair of scissors, and you can use that too. I never waste any part of this. And as you get to the bottom of the tree, you can leave it a full length like that and cut the tip off. Cut the tip right off, because that doesn't look right. You just cut it right off. And then flock the heck out of it. We'll show a picture of there where it's flocked. I think we have one next.
Yep, here we go.
Yep. Yeah, I
No,
use a flocking.
I find it a little large, I might say, for HO scale.
Oh, yeah.
So I tend to have more waste. But if you're looking for variety, and if you're certainly, as Pat was saying, looking for a good, durable tree structure that would be in the foreground, it's really worth a try because it does work very well. Sorry,
An
Pat. back to you.
idea, Paul, and an idea, if you're in a smaller scale, you could probably use some of these smaller pieces.
Yes.
You get ingenious, you can use some of these because some are very long, some are shorter. And that would work as your flocking surface. None of this can be wasted.
I'll sell you my scrap real cheap.
Go ahead, Paul. Yes, you can see how the flock attaches itself to the,
So here's a before and after
Yeah.
with the before at the top, right?
yep, yep. Moving on. Oh, yes. You can see how I did from that bottom picture on the right. It looks after it's been flocked and attached to your tree trunk. So I don't look too bad. I think it looks pretty good, but some people may look at it differently. But it is safer when somebody hits it, you don't have to worry about it going onto the floor and losing it. I lose more of my cassia than I do my plastic ones.
It's more brittle material.
Yep. And it makes a good redwood tree too. Moving on. Here's a close-up of how it attaches to your trunk. And it looks pretty good. Looks better further away, but I think it looks pretty good with the flocking material. You can use the clear ones for the bottom. It doesn't matter. It depends on what you're doing with it as far as the dead trees look. The polyfiber can be used for moss too. That makes it pretty good.
You're talking about moss in the ground?
Yeah. The one little trick I learned after doing these trees for a while, I wanted to have some root structure at the bottom of the tree. And I thought I'd try the old hot glue gun. And I used to squirt a little bit at the top and I would run it down in a bead and turn it into a big root. And then I would paint it after it would dry. And I would paint it a brown color and then add the colorings to it to make it look like a tree root. You do this on your foreground trees. I wouldn't do it to them all because as you look further back, you don't see it too often. You can also use plumber's putty to use on that too, rather than just hot glue.
Even spackle or drywall
Yeah.
compound will work and is easy to shape. One of the
Yep.
things we've noticed by looking at nature too is there's a tendency to feel that the only root that you see is, if it's you can see it at all, is at the base of the trunk. But in actual fact, in a lot of the forest areas that we walk into here in southern Ontario, you'll find certainly around coniferous trees, root breaking the surface maybe a meter away from the main trunk. So
Yep.
again, by observing, you can add a lot of texture in the foreground scenes. As Pat was saying, I invest my time in what's up close, which people can see when they're looking in on the layout, and then
Exactly.
just kind of an impression for the background.
You got it. Go ahead, Paul.
Thank you, sir. So here's some examples on Pat's layout of some of the different material in use. You'll notice that two of the trees that have been labeled here are actually using a product we've not talked about in this clinic, and that's one from Bragdon Enterprises. It's a preserved fern product, so real natural material that has been trimmed down for use by modelers. The problem with it, apart from expense, is that it tends to not hold its suppleness over time, becomes very stiff and dry, and that becomes an issue, particularly if it's in any location on your layout where you're going to be reaching in. It just does not stand up very well, and certainly not even to cleaning, which I know many of us loathe, but you don't see a lot of dust on trees in nature. Most places in the world, rain looks after that. So if you need to clean your layout once a year, over time, the Bragdon product we just found, Pat found, just doesn't stand up. Plastic fern armature, this last one that Pat's been talking about, are two examples in here. And as he was saying, you can judge for yourself how realistic you feel they might be. Most of us don't look a lot at Douglas firs, so it's hard to compare just on the basis of what's shown here. But again, we're trying to create an impression of the real world, that artistic approach where everything doesn't have to be precise, but where the eye kind of fills in the detail and just says to the brain, yeah, this looks realistic or not. Touchdown. Yes, go ahead, please, Pat.
But I did find out later from Bragdon himself that to help those trees out when they start to dry out on you is to get yourself some glycerin and water, or glycerin and alcohol. And what you do is you put a piece of paper behind it and spray the tree itself so it absorbs in and gets it subtle again. But I find that to be a pain in the neck if you're 18 to 24 inches away from them.
Well, and it is messy.
Yes. So you got to one or the other.
Yeah, yeah. So we've tended toward more of the artificial and the kind of product that Pat's been showing us here. I was just going to say, just to the left of the light standard that you see, which itself is left of center, you'll see, in fact, a little bottle brush tree. Now, it's been trimmed up so that it's not the uniform shape that tends to come out of a factory and looks a little bit more like the real world. But again, by mixing the textures, mixing the colors, we create the kind of palette that you see in the real world. And that's what helps when people see your layout for the first time. They go, oh, wow, hey, this looks really, really good. And that's, I think, one of the impressions that many of us like to leave with people who are, in particular, casual visitors to our layouts, is that the scenery that you've added in creates an appropriate backdrop for the real action, which is the train work itself.
Mm-hmm.
Couple more shots from Pat's layout of trees of various species using different armatures. And you, again, can see the color variations.
And Paul,
Yes, sir. Back to this one. Yep.
You see that little bottle brush tree in the middle down there?
Which one, the right or left? The right one?
On the right side.
Yeah,
that
here.
Came off a Christmas tree. One of those fake Christmas trees.
Yep.
I cut one off and shaped it around, and I hated cutting it because it's one of the hardest wires I ever tried to cut in my life. Anyway, that's what I used for that one.
So the bolt cutter came in handy.
Yeah, everything comes in handy.
One of the things I like about this scene is not just, again, the variety of trees that you can see. Some are very full, some are quite sparse. Again, very similar to one of those, if not two of those shots that we saw near the beginning that were taken in British Columbia. But you'll also see the variety of texture and colors in the undergrowth that's along the rock face and up to the tree line at the top. Again, very, very much the kind of setting that we would see. It will be different in different parts of not only North America, but around the world. But it's all that variation that I know we see in all of our countries. So drawing our inspiration from nature is I guess, the general advice we begin with and end with. And then one last shot, and even here you'll notice just above the Western Maryland hopper down on the left, there is a tree that's dead. So we sometimes forget to include those things. And again, I point out to you, not only is color added, but close to what in fact is the case in nature, there are some deciduous trees even in this dominant coniferous forest that tends to dominate all of the Rocky Mountains in British Columbia. You will find pockets of deciduous trees, and they add, again, variety, texture, color that just add life, candy for the eyes, as I sometimes like to say. Pat, final words from you?
I very well say this, that for some modelers, it's some of the fun in the hobby, and I find it very relaxing when I do it, building these trees. Buying trees can be very expensive, I find, after a while, and if you gotta have a lot of them, it can be very, very expensive. But they do make good trees out there from these dealers, and I don't want to say anything against them. They do a good job. Building things yourself is usually a great way to control some of the expense of our hobby. As you free time increases, but especially now, it can be another way of replacing hours that used to be consumed by work. If you need to create a volume of trees, whether foreground, background, or both, one of the best ways to obtain quality and realism and variety is to build some yourself. Simple as that. We hope this DIY article has given you enough information that you can attempt to create your own coniferous tree. Give it a try. You can't lose. You can't make a mess of it because the tree is never perfect.
Yeah,
Anyway.
invite a friend over like me for beer. Just see how many more you can create.
That's right. Anyway, on the last page, we have a few resources for you to find information. Modeling Trees, Part 2, Coniferous by Gordon Gravitt. And there's the information there. Identifying Trees, an all-season guide to Eastern North America by Williams Mike. And then there's the graining tool. Don't miss out on that one. I found that was the greatest way to grain it. I don't care what scale you're in, you can make a beautiful job.
But again, if you're asking in a store for it, remember that Pat said that he found it where the artificial flower ranging supplies were.
Yeah.
It's a tool used by people in that craft.
Okay, I think we said enough here. Quality hairspray, don't forget that one either. You don't want to smell like a hair shop.
Pat, you gave us a hint at the beginning. Could you provide for viewers that are interested the part number for that plastic fern sold by Hobby Lobby in the United States?
Part number is 540641. It's called a plastic floral.
Can you repeat that number a second time?
540641. You can order that online too. If you go online, I found it. That's it.
Excellent. Gentlemen, this was fantastic.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
We got a couple of questions here in a few minutes, if you're game, huh?
Yeah, we're game.
So I guess one question I had was, how do you deal with, what's your opinion about dealing with kind of tree height and compression? You know, you hear about how sort of trees in nature are really much taller than what many model. How do you address that, Pat?
Well, I think in your foreground, you want your tallest trees. In the background, you want your shortest trees because it gives you a visual like the real thing you see out west. You see it looks smaller as you look up. As you get closer, there's bigger trees. That's the way I would do it. And always remember, there is no special size. There any size you want to put them, anywhere from 20 feet to 200 feet. So in 1/4 inch scale, that's a pretty big tree.
How tall are those ones that you showed us today? Those would be on your O scale layout, and how tall would they tend to be?
Those there, they range anywhere from 8 inches to 12 inches.
Okay.
To 14 inches.
All right.
I also just use photographs or things that I've seen, but photographs help me when I'm back home again. Having a tree in comparison to a utility pole, having a tree in comparison to a building gives me a starting point. And then kind of along the lines of what Pat was saying, I just make sure that when I'm starting with my trunk, where I'm putting the effort into a foreground tree, making sure that it's not going to overpower what it's going to be around. Here in Ontario, where we live, when you get further north, in fact, I had one in my backyard, you can get what is called a white pine, and they can grow 60 feet. Well, I wouldn't necessarily want to have that in my foreground, even if it had been there in the real world. It would simply be too big and overpower the scene. So, you know, we have creative license. There's so many articles and clinics that are out there in which we can play with components to get the scene to look right. And I think that's what I would do in terms of the scale size issue.
Right. I think just like sometimes you have to compress the buildings to make it all work you have to do that with a 150-foot tree also.
Well, and if I've compressed what it was a large building, if I put a very large tree beside it, it's going to suddenly make the building look a lot smaller. If I want it to be, for example, I've got a large a flour mill. It is a very dominant structure, so all of the vegetation that's around it, trees, shrubs, everything else, in addition to the rolling stock, communicate to the eye, this is a big building.
Right, right. Let's see. Tom G asked, what brand of weathering powders did you mention early on?
Doc O'Brien's
Okay.
weathering powder. I think most people have heard of that one.
Yeah, he probably just missed the name there. That sounds good.
Mhm.
And well, I think you started to address this a little bit later, but Andy had asked a question early on about whether the branches go up or down, right? He said sometimes the artificial trees show spruce and fir trees sticking downwards, but in most pictures, the real thing, they stick upwards. I guess one of the lessons learned is you got to do a little bit of research and figure out, because you guys showed some that went up and some that went down, right?
Well,
Yeah,
just take a look
trick
at
is
what's on the
to-
screen now. If you look just slightly to the upper left of the cube, you'll
What-
very clearly see a branch that's bending downward on that tree. I don't know what the species is,
Yeah,
but you're right. Take your cue from nature. And
yeah.
those silhouettes that you can find by Googling I find them an invaluable resource.
You mentioned also about kind of dusting and cleaning your layout. How do you actually clean these or keep these trees clean when we put so much effort into them like that?
Yeah,
Pat,
very
what do
light,
you think?
very light use of what do you call it? Handheld vacuum with a soft brush on it.
Yeah.
Just lightly. Otherwise, you're going to suck all that stuff off. And have to start over.
You end up sucking all that hard work right off of that.
I also will use, Pat made reference to a soft brush. One great soft brush for certain kinds of cleaning is a makeup brush.
Yeah.
Have you ever sort of estimated what the cost of one of these trees is, sort of all done?
I estimated if you were doing one of the big trees, you're probably looking at around 12 to 14 bucks.
That's what you've put into it.
Yeah. Because of the time.
Yeah.
If you want to consider your time worth money. Otherwise, it's not very much for material.
Okay.
You can buy a whole bouquet of that Caspia
Mm,
for
yeah.
peanuts. I mean,
Right.
and you just hang it upside down and let it dry.
And the paint goes a long, long way.
Oh yeah.
Is there something you would recommend for us in scalers in terms of what would be a good trunk? For,
I would use the balsa, but you don't need a lot of it then. You could use the balsa in smaller scale. Like
Also,
always
you can get bags of for end scale. I don't know how it sizes out, but I would look at the wood skewers. For shish kebab.
okay.
Yeah,
Many
no.
of us use them as an uncoupling tool as well.
Sure.
But
That's a good idea.
I'd probably start there.
Shish kebab skewers are already grained too. You don't have to bother with it.
And that's good. And I guess mostly these are kind of trees you would use in the foreground. You put so much effort into them. What do you do for your background trees?
In my case, I used it all front and back
You use the same kind.
because I was making them. I didn't care. I just went from front to back, and I used smaller ones in the back.
Okay.
And still, if you put something that's entirely different, it's going to show up too quickly.
Yeah.
You want it to blend together.
Yeah, but then how do you deal with it? I mean, I remember the first time I did a scene with trees on it, I made, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 trees and thought that was perfect. And then I put them on the layout and I
It
realized
disappeared.
200.
It disappeared.
Yeah. How do you deal? You just have to deal with it, right?
Well, you have to deal with it, but also I would put some bigger trees in them because that takes up some of the space.
Yeah.
Put too many small ones and you have to have too many.
I'm dealing with the very problem that you just referenced in HO scale. I've got an escarpment that very much dominates the Niagara Peninsula that the Toronto Hamilton Buffalo Railroad ran through and up. And I've been spending a lot of time trying to think, well, how am I going to handle this one? And I suspect it's going to be kind of along the lines of what Pat was just saying. It's going to be a combination of a little more detail at the foreground of the escarpment, but in behind it, I'm just going to create kind of the facsimile. So probably, I've just been playing with it right now, but balls of polyfiber with different color of green mixed in with some of the underbrush material like, lichen and some of the other materials just to create some texture.
You can put small bottle trees.
Maybe, but yeah, again, certainly variety will be the key. But yeah, just how to cover that kind of an expanse. I've got, for people who would not have an idea what I'm dealing with, I've got an escarpment scene that's going to run about 11 feet long, and at its high point, it will be about 10 inches high. So I've got a lot of surface to cover. So yeah, I don't want to spend all my time making trees, and in a lot of cases, I need to. I like the approach that was mentioned in a great clinic last year as a part of the X series, and it talked about how our hobby, when it comes certainly to scenery and weathering, is artistic. And so I take some of my cue, not necessarily executed the greatest, but I take up a lot of my cue from Impressionism. You just create the appearance of, or the hint of, the real world. And as long as your colors are realistic and other things kind of work, the brain has this amazing ability to just kind of fill in the void. That's kind of what I'm going to do with the escarpment.
That's awesome. Well, gentlemen, this has been fantastic. We really appreciate it. Lots of people enjoyed it. Here's some feedback I heard. Clark says that you guys were really out on a limb today.
That's Clark for you.
and without a net.
And it says that Andy said it was a great clinic, but you might be leasing shortly. So you can see where our folks were here. So we appreciate you both going out on a limb with us today.
Yes, and we
get your wife
appreciate the humor.
involved.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And
we enjoyed it.
And soon.
Thanks for having us.
You bet. Bye now.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.